since I'll be working around here, the nipples on that vacuum line are very easy to break off of there. And so rather than risk breaking them, it's easier just to pull this line off. And it just takes a 19 and a 17 millimeter. The shock has got two nuts on it. One of them serves as a lock nut against the other. So this is the shaft, the shock shaft, the thing that the piston, and it's connected to the piston. And so what we need to do is hold one of these 17 millimeters and loosen up on the other one. Now, if you notice, the top of the shaft of that shock is squared off. That's so if you have to, you can hold it like with a pair of vice grips. They actually make a special tool. I just put a pair of vice grips on it if I need to, if that shaft starts to turn. If I'm lucky, it won't. But the bottom nut is turning on me, and these are so thin that I might have to try to find a thin 17 millimeter wrench so that I'm not grabbing both of them at once. And I just happened to get lucky. Now, as I said, sometimes that shaft, the piston for the shock, sometimes it turns, and so you have to hold it on the flat part with a pair of vice grips or something. This particular one is probably still under somewhat of a strain because of the spring. I could relieve the strain by jacking it up a little bit. Let me do that. Now I just put a jack under there just to relieve the pressure a little bit on that shock shaft. Just so the nut's not so hard to get off. But I don't want to jack it off my jack stands. I just want to barely relieve the pressure. But this nut is just going to be hard all the way off, apparently. The shock off, of course, there was just the rubber washer like that, and then the steel washer and the nut. And finally, the nut backs off all the way, and I'm able to hold that shaft with a vice grip long enough to get the nut loose. And so now the shock will just come right out. Do is depress the piston in the shock and just bring it out here, because I need to take these two little 10 millimeter bolts off of this arm. And you can see, if you look very closely, they're like 12-point bolts. In other words, they've got 12 points on there. You can't get a box end wrench. It's either going to take, I'm sorry, you can't get an open end. It'll either take a box end or a socket, but it's a 10 millimeter. It's relatively simple. Because of the position of the shock, I'm able to get a socket on that back bolt now. And so I'll just put a ratchet in the socket. Now these shocks, finally I got that bolt out of there. That's all there is to pulling the shock off. You can see I can press this one down fairly easily. In other words, it doesn't even take much pressure. If I put this steel part down, you see the gas isn't all the way out of there. The oil, they're oil and gas filled. They're under gas pressure, but they've got oil that pushes through a little hole. But you see that one's fairly easy. They just ought to be stiffer than that. I've got another one I'm going to put on there. It's not brand new, but it's still good. I'll show you the difference. This one is not one of the originals that came on this car, because you can tell it's not a German one, but you see how much difficult that was for me to compress and how slow it moves. So the gas pressure is a lot better in that shock, and that's one I'm going to use. But I have to really lean on that one to move it compared to this, which is really just worn out. And you see, I can see how fast I can press that thing down, just like that. That one's no good. There's really nothing to it. There's a little rubber bushing and steel, piece of steel on the bottom, then rubber bushing. You just push it up through that hole and then attach it right there. And then what we would do is just put those two bolts in there, okay? And as I say, what I would do is mash the shock down like that and put those two bolts in first, and then force the shock under pressure to be in a down position so that I could get this through the top hole once I assemble those two bolts. And then typically what I have to do is put a jack under this arm and jack it up, because I need about another 1/2 inch to an inch to get threads onto that shock shaft. And so you just put a jack in a little block of wood or something, whatever it takes, if your jack isn't high enough, to compress this spring in order to push the shock all the way through the hole enough to get the bolt on it, and then just tighten up the bolt. That's all there is to replacing the front shocks on these Mercedes 123s. They're pretty simple.